Well, thank you, Joe, very much. It's very nice to be back with you again today. I also want to send our best wishes and prayers to Tommy Ice, who is a wonderful defender of the faith. Well, as an evangelical Christian, I've been interested in Israel in terms of advocacy for 20 plus years. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to partner with some friends in New York, the America-Israel Friendship League, in doing church outreach programs where we obviously talk about Israel, but I have the blessing, really, of tailoring these in a way that I think they need to be done. My good friend Bill Koenig is a guy who, like me, believes that you can't fully advocate for Israel if you don't include Bible. Just secular advocacy, in my experience, doesn't fully penetrate the human heart, especially when it comes to millennials today. And so, for the last 7-8 years, a big part of my research has been the shifting attitudes toward Israel in this country, specifically in the evangelical church, and most specifically among millennials. So, I have a table out there with some brochures and sign-up sheet for a newsletter. I'm also working on organizing a trip to Israel. The AIFL does tremendous work there in taking youth groups and student groups and others, but I want to take a group of people who would be interested in seeing some things from a unique perspective. So sign up for our newsletter, and I'll be available to talk, of course, today and tomorrow. The issue of millennial attitudes toward Israel is somewhat of an underreported story. I think it's a huge story. I will tell you that I believe in being a realist, and I think that we need to recognize where we are. It would be wonderful if Israel's support was as strong as it was when I was growing up. I do not believe that to be the case. Now, it's still strong among us, and there's a sizable population that supports Israel, and I think culturally Americans in general appreciate Israel as an ally. But we are losing fervor for Israel that comes from the heart. And by the way, I was born and raised Southern Baptist. I will get you out for lunch on time. I promise. It never leaves you. Joel Rosenberg had a really great quote. He said, "Unless the church gives younger believers a healthy, balanced, solidly biblical understanding of God's love and plan for Israel, overall evangelical support for the Jewish state could very well plummet over the next decade as millennials represent an ever larger percentage of the overall church body." I couldn't agree more. I would go further than that. It will plummet. There's some interesting things going on. Christians United for Israel just announced they passed the 4 million mark in membership. That's really remarkable. At the same time, we're seeing a serious drop-off for support of Israel among millennials. And again, in my opinion, it's because we have not made the case so much biblically. And, I can say what I want, so I'll say that even a lot of the pro-Israel Christian organizations don't give enough voice to this. The thing is, the goal, I think, is that we are balanced, as you should be in most things. You can't include what I would call fringe Bible prophecy teaching, but you also can't go just strictly secular data. It only goes so far in appealing to people to support Israel. I think that you can find the proper blend of both. The biblical story of Israel is really very simple. It's not complex. It's very basic. Jeremiah 31:10 says, "He that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock." Well, there's the whole sweep of Jewish history right there. And it's all true. But I find that most people, particularly millennials, not because they're not intelligent, they're certainly intelligent, but they don't have information. They don't know history, and so they don't realize some of the basic story of Israel, that they were scattered from the land 2,000 years ago, exiled. I think the return, the ingathering, the return of the Jews in our time is perhaps the greatest miracle in human history. It's absolutely astonishing. And I've studied this for decades, and the hair stands up on the back of my neck when I think about it, which is every day. So it's a simple story. It's not something that's complex that you have to, study for years and years and then present to someone. You can start a conversation with anyone about this. But again, you have to appeal in some way to the supernatural. Because if you just talk about the rocket threats that Hezbollah has against Israel in Lebanon, or if you just talk about the Iranian threats and that sort of thing, frankly, people are interested to a point, but that's where it's going to stay. Explaining the specialness of the Jewish people and Israel is the key. Now, in the lead up to World War II, Germany had marinated for centuries in anti-Jewish thought, at least since the time of Martin Luther. And the German Christian movement was a group of churches that decided they weren't going to rock the boat with Hitler. And so one of the things they did, again, drawing on hundreds of years at least of anti-Semitism, was they wanted to de-emphasize teaching the Old Testament in the churches and thereby removing Jews from the Bible, removing Jewish history. Can you imagine? What are you talking about? The Bible is set in Israel. The writers of the Bible are Jews. The Messiah is a Jew. The names and the foundation and on the gates of the New Jerusalem will be Jewish. From beginning to end, the Bible is thoroughly Jewish. So how do you teach it and remove the Jews? Well, they somewhat managed to do it. And I would argue that we are seeing somewhat of a repeat of along those lines here today in this country. Now, some of the things that I'm going to mention, I want to qualify what I'm going to say. Some of the people that I'm going to talk about, I don't mean that they're Nazis or going to be Nazis or identify with the Nazi ideology. That's not my point. My point is, when you minimize Jewish history from the Bible, you're going to end up in a bad place. Okay? Millennials today are really fascinating. They're very eclectic in their thinking. They're open to a lot of things, and for whatever reason, a lot of them are enamored of old white theologians. I don't know why. Walter Bergman, N.T. Wright, who I call N.T. Wrong. Wright is not what I'd call a pro-Israel guy. He would be one more who seeks to minimize, not wholesale. He's too clever for that. But minimize enough of Israel in Jewish history. Prophecy is not his thing, and supporting Israel biblically is not his thing. Here he's seen with somebody I'll talk about more in a bit, Cameron Strang is a publisher of Relevant magazine. Relevant is the leading periodical among Christian millennials, certainly. Up to 2005, I think he was what I would call pro-Israel, and then everything shifted for him because he started going to a place called Israel-Palestine with his friend Lynn Hybels of Willow Creek. By the way, I don't know where Palestine is. If any of you do know, let me know. I can't find it on a real map, but they go to this mythical place called Israel-Palestine. Palestine today is a political term. It's political. It's an effort to shove Israel out of their country. Relevant, I don't know what the term would be today for millennials, but they're cutting edge, and one of the things they do, they would not be, like for my age and up, they would not be what you'd call a biblical magazine, but there's certainly a flavor of Christianity to it. But like, for example, cover story on Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm Gladwell, he'd probably describe himself as some kind of a gadfly. He just, he writes, he's kind of a cultural observer. He wrote a book called David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants, in which he inferred that the story of David and Goliath was myth. This kind of thing, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say you have no idea what has come into the evangelical church in the last several years. You'd be shocked if you understand how left-wing ideology has burrowed into the church. It's absolutely staggering. One of the offshoots, of course, is a downturn in support for Israel because the left hates Israel. Relevant, and Cameron Strang wrote the cover story called Blessed Are the Peacemakers, and it was his take on the Arab-Israeli conflict. In my view, I'm giving you my opinion, it was an anti-Israel piece. But he didn't want to talk about that when there was some pushback. In fact, he canceled a podcast that was going to discuss it, which is another hallmark of the left. When you call them on something and they can't defend it, they don't want to talk about it anymore. Conferences now are catering toward millennials in the evangelical world. I attended the Justice Conference in Chicago 3 years ago. The keynote speaker, and for those of you who know him, I'm not making this up, was Dr. Cornel West, or as they call him, Brother Corn. Brother Corn is a self-described scholar, Princeton, and really some large platforms he's been given. But he describes himself as a non-Marxist socialist. And I say this every time I give this presentation. You know what a non-Marxist socialist is, don't you? He's a Marxist, right? Because they want to fool you. So I go to this conference, and I'm sitting on the front row, and there's 2,000 millennials behind me, most of them Christian, in the Chicago Auditorium downtown. And this guy starts talking about white privilege, white guilt, white colonialism, and it was scary. And they were cheering like mad. One of the things about Brother Corn is he's pro-Palestinian. Now, I want to talk for a couple of minutes on some people who are key, some of them up-and-coming leaders within the evangelical community. I'm talking about writers, speakers, parachurch groups, that kind of thing. And I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon too, but again, I want you to get in your mind how pervasive this is. This is systemic within the evangelical world in America today. This isn't one denomination or this ministry or a couple of these guys over here. It's all across the board from sea to shining sea, and it's deep, okay? These leftist views have come in. And again, for our purposes today, we're talking about how that affects support for Israel with a view ahead to what that support is going to look like in the next generation. It's going to look really, really, really bad. Okay? Q Ideas is a group started by a guy named Gabe Lyons, the gentleman seated on the right. You know, like most of these people, I think he identifies as just kind of straight down the line, garden variety evangelical. Now, some of them use the label evangelical to fool real evangelicals. I'm not saying he does. I'm saying a lot of them do. People like Brian McLaren. They do it so that they can enter into that community and thus corrupt it with left-wing ideology. Now, Q Ideas is a format where they go into different cities and they'll have some kind of a conference and they'll have different subjects that they talk about. One of them a couple of years ago was they talked about cannabis. They talked about transgender people and how we relate to them. You know, what are you talking about? Among church, what is this? You see what we're doing? We're moving from conservative America to left-wing America. The gentleman he's interviewing is Sami Awad, a Palestinian Christian from Bethlehem who's very connected to Bethlehem Bible College. And in the last 10 years, Sami has spearheaded the efforts in this country to push the Palestinian narrative in churches. And he's done this with his friends in the American church, like Lynn Hybels of Willow Creek Church, the same one who took Cameron Strang to a mythical place called Palestine. So Sami, who is really anti-Israel but presents himself as a nonviolent protester on the lines of Gandhi, you know, they're very clever, see? They know that still in America you can't openly assault Israel, so they'll do it subtly. So he comes over and he talks about, you know, like in these settings and in churches, you know, sadly enough, how the Israelis brutalize the Palestinians. You know, everything from violence at checkpoints, these poor people just trying to get to work, to water rationing. They're pushing the Palestinian narrative in a huge way in the American church. Now, David Horowitz of Front Page Magazine, a great resource, Horowitz uses a term called discover the networks, and I found it to be really enlightening in opening up how you think about this. Because that's what it is. You have to discover the networks. You have to see who is in community with who, okay? And you'll find, I think, that 95% of the famous evangelicals in this country are all in the same club. They're all in the same community. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't mean that they all are anti-Israel, or at least that they're not anti-Israel as what they normally do. Now, some of them are, but some of them aren't. But, again, running in the circles they do, an anti-Israel person like, I'm giving you my opinion, Tony Campolo, or Shane Claiborne, or Brian McLaren, or Lynn Hybels, even though she calls herself pro-Israeli, pro-Palestine, pro-Jesus, I don't know, whatever it is. They're pushing the Palestinian narrative. So the people I'm going to talk about in large part are just part of this club. And if they're not overtly anti-Israel, they're very left-wing in other things they do. Jen Hatmaker is becoming a superstar on the lecture circuit and as an author. Especially popular with women in the evangelical church. She and her husband started a church in Austin, Texas. Jen Hatmaker, in my opinion, is left-wing. And so where it matters, like her, her social media stuff, where she's, and by the way, they all cross-promote each other too. That's part of the deal. It's all marketing. It's all marketing to build your brand. That's what it's about. That's what large-scale evangelical ministry in this country is largely about today. Not all of them, but many of them. It's marketing. So they market each other. So her associations with people like Jonathan Martin, who I'll talk about later, Pentecostal background, he's pushing the Palestinian narrative. So it's in the air is what I'm trying to say. It's in the water. Now, remember I talked about minimizing Jewish history in the Bible. It's done in subtle ways in this country and aided greatly by the fact that biblical illiteracy in this country is a plague. It is a scourge. The level of biblical illiteracy in this country is off the charts, I think. So, this is from, I think I saw this 15 years ago, the Quest Study Bible, published by Zondervan, which, by the way, is now owned by HarperCollins, the huge secular left-wing publishing entity. Okay, so it's always interesting to look at these Bible commentaries where it touches on Israel, and also, and this is a side note, where it touches on creation. You can see where somebody's coming from if you know what they believe about the beginning of the Bible. So in the great passages in Ezekiel 36 through 39, they ask the question, particularly about chapter 36, did Ezekiel foresee the modern Israel? Well, of course the answer is yes, but you can't produce a commentary Bible and just say yes. You have to have other stuff, see? Yes, and let's move on, or let's talk about that, because it's incredible. The regathering of the Jews, yeah, he did, through the help of the Holy Spirit. But then they say there are others who see this prophecy primarily fulfilled in the return of Israel from captivity in Babylon. They believe modern parallels of the Jews returning to their homelands are mostly coincidental. Really. Listen, you ask anybody, and the more famous the better. You ask Brian McLaren, Shane Claiborne, Tony Campolo, Lynn Hybels to explain the modern restoration of the Jews to Palestine and the modern state of Israel apart from the Bible, they can't do it. You ask anybody that question, and there is your entry into an interesting conversation. That's what we should be talking to our kids about. The modern fulfillment of prophecy through the restoration of Israel in the modern state of Israel. Another, it's subtle, I guess, but it's effective. And we've all seen them. They were in our Bibles even when I was a kid. But, maps depicting where Jesus lived in Palestine. Where? In the first century? They didn't know anything about Palestine. Jesus didn't live in Palestine. He wasn't born in Palestine. He didn't die in Palestine. He wasn't resurrected in Palestine. He did all those things in Israel. Lifeway Christian Stores, the flagship publishing entity of the Southern Baptist Convention, they sell this stuff all day long. I'm telling you right now, this is part of how Jewish history is being removed from the Bible in this country today. Now, here's a comment, here's a quote from Jack Serra, who's president of Bethlehem Bible College. They host every couple of years and I hate to even say this phrase, Christ at the Checkpoint conference. That's so offensive. And what it is they're talking about liberation theology with regard to the Palestinians, that the Palestinians are now the oppressed people in the land, just like Jesus was oppressed by the Romans 2,000 years ago. It's a convoluted ideology. But anyway, listen to this. He's talking, of course, about the famous dry bones prophecy in Ezekiel 37. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of the West Bank, Bethlehem, Jenin, Nablus, and Ramallah. It was full of bones. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? Can the Palestinian people live? Then he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. You see, the Palestinian people here were and are a lot like this valley of dry bones that is in need of the church to come and prophesy life on them. That is blasphemous. And that is using Scripture, that is sanitizing Jewish history out of the Bible, and that is using this for political purposes to promote the PLO. Okay? These people are promoting the same worldview as the PLO, or as it's called today, the Palestinian Authority. It's the same thing. How grotesque. I would think long and hard about sending my child to a Christian seminary or even a Christian college today. I certainly wouldn't send him to Fuller. Fuller Seminary in Southern California is probably the flagship seminary in the country, has been left-wing for decades. Their president, Mark Laverton, spoke at Christ at the Checkpoint. They also send students on trips to Israel-Palestine routinely. Fuller is very left-wing. One of the things, and I'll talk more about this later, the people pushing the Palestinian narrative, they did a very smart thing. They're not stupid. You know, they realized that a lot of Catholic traditions and the mainline churches years ago were anti-Israel. So they don't need to keep working that ground again. They got smart and went straight to the heart of the evangelical world. See, they're going for the whole thing. They are working right now to co-opt the Southern Baptist Convention and the Pentecostal world. See, you know, there's 45,000 SBC churches in this country and almost that many Assemblies of God churches. They know what they're doing. Jonathan Martin here, former pastor, he's now gone off and he's got a career as a speaker, writer, has Pentecostal roots, and he advocates for the Palestinians. Millennial heroes today, some of them are people like Nelson Mandela. So they use Mandela's image here, free Palestine, boycott Israel. This is part of the BDS movement. Boycott, divestment, sanctions. It's a political, economic weapon to be used against Israel where they want to boycott businesses that do business in Israel. Okay, so Caterpillar, you know, and places like that build homes and things in Israel. A lot of the mainline churches have pulled their investments out of those companies. But anyway, but you see, a guy like Mandela is a hero to a millennial because they just see him as a freedom fighter. They aren't aware of his Marxist ideology. Now back to the heart of the evangelical world. This is Ann Voskamp, who is, like Jen Hatmaker, really a popular writer today. She did that book, 1,000 Gifts, I think it was, which is in probably every church in the country and every bookstore. Here she's in that place called Palestine. This very reflective photo on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. She went with her friend Lynn Hybels. See? So Ann Voskamp is going to get what I call the PLO tour. See? She's going to go under their pro-Israeli, pro-Jesus, pro-peace. I can't remember all of them. There's several of them. It's all a tool to fool people, frankly. They go and they're going to, they say that they hear a diverse number of voices. You know, that they'll talk to, let's see, there was a film, which I'll reference later. The film, Town of Bethlehem, Little Town of Bethlehem. So they said, you know, well, we talked to a Muslim, a Christian, and an Israeli Jew, Well, yeah, but they're all anti-Israel. See how they do that? See how clever that is? Yeah, they're going and talking to a diverse number of people in terms of socioeconomic stuff and all that, but they are all united in one thing, and that is that it's all Israel's fault. So what do you think Ann Voskamp is going to do when she gets back to the States and continues to build her brand? Well, moving in her networks, we're discovering the networks, she's going to talk about the big bad Israelis that she saw. But if I can use the term this way, the weapon that we have is Bible, right? The weapon that can't be defeated. You can't explain the existence of the Jews today apart from the Bible, and with the logical conclusion that God exists. It's like Dave Hunt said. I love this quote from him years ago. He was talking about those chapters at the end of Zechariah about this final climactic battle for Jerusalem. And he said, can you explain to me why the world would even care about this little town in the Middle East, apart from the fact that God said it would be that way? That's remarkable. When you explain it like this to millennials, they'll listen to what you're saying. You can have a conversation. The only way to turn the tide of this pro-Palestinian narrative in this country, in my view, is to do it this way. Because if you want to go at it and talk about how tiny Israel is and how vulnerable they are to their enemies around them, how many wars have been started against them, if you want to talk about Hamas tunnels in Gaza, if you want to talk about Iran threatening to nuke them, you're only going to get so far with people. You're going to have a much greater chance to advocate for Israel if you point out the obvious. The existence of the modern state of Israel is living proof that Bible prophecy is true. It's all true. It's all true. Jesus isn't returning to Palestine, right? When he comes back, he'll come back to the modern state of Israel. This is a key thing that you must get in your mind. Wherever you are, you can have an effect. It's incorrect to say that, well, I'm one person, I live in the Midwest, and I have a job, and I don't have time to do this, and I can't make a difference. I can't turn the tide of this attack on millennial worldview. Yes, you can. Do you know young people at all? Anybody in your family that's young? Well, if they're going to school in this country, they're vulnerable. So you countermand that argument, and you bring your own information to them. Sit down and have a conversation with them. That's all it takes. You don't have to have a PhD in systematic theology. Just know what you know the simple story that God said he would scatter the Jews for a period of time, he would preserve them, and then he would bring them back. He did all those things. He did it in our time. That last part. Never forget, if you're discouraged about where this country is going and discouraged about where the world is at and discouraged about all this stuff, I want you to remember, you live in the moment when the Jews re-entered history. Do you know how incredible that is? That should give you a spring in your step every day. And that is our argument to the Palestinian narrative. Remember that verse, he that scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd doth his flock. My goodness. What a remarkable miracle that God has allowed us to see. This is how you penetrate the human heart in advocating for Israel and the Jewish people. Ariel Sharon, I'll close with this because I'm going to get you to the restaurant on time. Sharon, the great Sharon, the Israeli General Patton. I might have mentioned this the last time I was here, I can't remember, but I met him once, and he was as incredible in real life as you would think he was. Here was the guy that, and I know people get on his case about turning Gaza over to the Palestinians, but, you know, here's the larger point. In the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War, Sharon saved Israel. His daring crossing of the Suez Canal completely flipped the tables on the Egyptians and saved Israel from destruction. So Sharon was used, in my opinion, by God as a modern Joshua. And while he wasn't known as a religious person, I was talking to him. I talked to him for an hour in his office in Tel Aviv once. This was during the first term of Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister. And we're talking about politics and the Palestinians and the prospects for peace and all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden he stopped and he took it in a completely different direction. He looked at me and he said, "Do you know what our biggest problem is in this country?" And I said, "No, what?" He says, "We don't teach our children enough Bible." Isn't that remarkable? I think this man understood what was going on, you know? In his biography, he said there's something that keeps this nation. Yes, there is. So while he wasn't a man of faith as we would think, I think he understood what was going on. And so he made a statement one time around that time, and shortly before he became prime minister, he was talking about, you know, the Jewish communities in Israel. Some people call them settlements. Settlement is a political term designed to bash Israel. They're communities of Jews who live in the land of Israel. That's what they are. But he said, you know, people are talking about the outlines of a Palestinian state and our borders and that kind of thing. He says, we're here to stay. I have another friend who's very highly placed in Israel, and I was talking to him once about, you know, back when I used to be concerned about this stuff, and then I realized that God always keeps his promises. I was concerned about, you know, pushing the Palestinian state and moving the Jews out of what's called the West Bank, and he laughed and he said, "Jim, please." He said, "There's 500,000 Jews living there." He says, "We're not going anywhere. Nobody's moving any Jews out of the land. It's not going to happen. Might cause a war." Does that sound familiar? So, Sharon said almost verbatim what Amos 9:15 records, God speaking and says, "I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them." This is the message that we should be giving millennials in the church today. Thank you.